Walt Disney was a busy fellow, and 1966 proved to be another active year on his expanding calendar. Many things were brewing within the Walt Disney Company, and as per the usual, Walt would have a significant hand in each of them. Walt, the leader of the Walt Disney Studios, was guiding the production and development of its 19th animated feature film, The Jungle Book. An adaptation of the classic Rudyard Kipling novel, The Jungle Book would see Disney bringing new light to the man-cub Mowgli and his wild adventures. This film would be among the first to heavily employ the use of popular actors in the voice roles. Phil Harris, Sebastian Cabot, and Louis Prima would bring a familiar and jazzy presence to the screen. It would be released to audiences in the following year. Walt was also happily producing The Happiest Millionaire, a musical adapted from a play adapted from a novel called My Philadelphia Father. Directed by Norman Tokar, the story would follow the happy-go-lucky Irish immigrant Jaw Lawless into the home of eccentric rich man Anthony J. Drexel Biddle, played by Fred MacMurray, and his family. The movie would feature a full soundtrack with music and lyrics written exclusively by the ever-rising in popularity Sherman Brothers. It would be released to audiences in the following year. While Walt was also overseeing the transition of his popular World's Fair attractions from their temporary New York stage to their permanent Disneyland residence, he was also shepherding the brand new attractions that were soon to be entering into the park. Huge expansions in Disneyland would open this year, and even more attractions were on the impending horizon. The Disneyland park, just as Walt had always intended it, was a constantly morphing, changing, and transformingly magical and wondrous environment. These objectives would prove ever true in the following months and years, as Disneyland would say so long to a handful of attractions and welcome several new ones. And Walt as well was in the process of developing a special skiing resort in what is now Sequoia National Park called Mineral King. Walt had visited the area recreationally many times before and had been extremely keen in developing something within that type of wintry environment ever since he had been placed in charge of producing the opening and closing ceremonies for the 1960 Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley, California. In 1965, the Sierra Nevada land that housed the ideal vacation destination became available for potential resort development by the Forest Service. Of the several that offered varying designs, Walt made the winning proposal and was given the green light to explore and expand his idea for a Disney resort there. Once completed, Mineral King, coined as the American Alpine Wonderland, would be a vital stop for skiers all around the world. It would be of the largest and most accommodating resorts for the sport, and it boasted estimates of nearly 1 million visitors per year. It would have featured numerous restaurants and general shops, movie theaters, ice rinks and convention centers, a 5-story hotel, and of course, a large-capacity ski lift that would send guests to various peaks along the surrounding hill. With Walt at the helm, production on this project was moving swiftly. And Walt as well, for several years, had been contributing to the merging of two art schools, the Chouinard Art Institute and the Los Angeles Conservatory of Music, into a brand new program and school he was founding called the California Institute of the Arts. Its purpose would be to foster students pursuing careers in visual and performing arts. This included actors, musicians, and especially artists and animators. Walt wanted to establish a community of the arts that would provide a place to develop the talent of the future. CalArts would potentially be the training ground where Disney and American entertainment could find its evolving legs, as growing artists with new flair and capabilities would perfect and hone their craft here. CalArts would be one of the first professional schools that students could graduate with an accredited degree in art, drama, music, dance, writing, and more. At CalArts, these artists would be taught by professionals in the form and would be able to establish their forte and artful identity. Even some of Disney's animators would give lectures and teach workshops within the school. Walt was adamant that academics should play no role in the admissions process, but rather solely on the candidates' talents in the arts. In the future, many of the big players in Disney animation and beyond would find their igniting beginnings within the halls of CalArts. Walt soon hoped to complete this merger by having one single campus that could house and champion the creativity learning there.
A project so vast, it has already been called a whole new Disney World. And now, here is Walt Disney.
Walt was undertaking and overseeing many different tasks and ventures, but none of which could overtake Walt's involvement in his latest enterprise. Walt was no longer satisfied with shaping American culture and the way it loved to be entertained through media and amusement parks. He wanted to go further and shape and perfect the way America could and would live in the world of the future. Walt Disney always seemed to be at the forefront of innovation, whether it be within animation and the broad strokes he made by incorporating color, or sound, or full-length features, or perhaps even in theme parks as he entertained new technologies that brought steel roller coasters, underwater ride systems, and audio animatronics to the table. He was always finding ways to elaborate and advance every aspect of entertainment that he could, and now Walt pined to perfect the heart of progress and civilization itself. Walt had recently just purchased a sizable area of land in Central Florida. The proclaiming press conference ensured that Orlando would soon be home to a brand new East Coast Disneyland. But what wasn't quite mentioned during the broadcast was the driving force behind the entire purchase. That force was EPCOT, an acronym standing for the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. What Walt dreamed would be a living blueprint of the future. In his later years, Walt developed a unique interest in the design of cities and urban planning. EPCOT was going to be a functioning city, a multi-level community that would revolutionize industry, transportation, modern living, recreation, and more. Walt saw the problems facing the modern city, and EPCOT proposed a special solution to each of them. It was to be the progress city, the first original of what could potentially be commonplace around the world. Walt was met with a great deal of protest within his company. They just didn't understand. It was going to cost a fortune, and to what benefit to the company. It was a challenge to get them to see it his way, and for the most part, he failed to do that. But luckily, it was Walt who was in the driver's seat. He had final say, and he wanted EPCOT. The design of Disneyland itself was heralded by some as the greatest piece of urban design in the United States. Disneyland was ingeniously designed with a central hub that encouraged flow. Guests were efficiently able to navigate within the park, reaching each of the lands and destinations therein with ease. With that in mind, EPCOT would imitate the intelligent hub-and-spoke layout of Disneyland. The hub would begin with the city center, fully enclosed from the outside elements, meaning the Florida weather would never be able to hinder the progress happening within the city. This would be where EPCOT worked. This would lead into the Greenbelt, a sizable stretch of parks, stadiums, and grassy garden areas. This would be where EPCOT played. This section would lead into a residential area featuring housing that in essence would be a testing ground for various companies to install fresh technologies and inventions. The true life families of EPCOT would have access to the latest prototypes and innovation. This would be where EPCOT lived. Connecting all of these areas would be a vast network of transit, including monorails that would take residents to EPCOT's connecting industrial park, or perhaps the opposite way towards Disneyland's East Coast installment, the Magic Kingdom. Internally within the city would be a spread of Wedway people movers, taking residents directly from their homes to the city and back, plus pedestrian pathways and multi-level underground roadways that would offer simple and focused routes for both automobile and semi-trailer going in and through the city. No stoplights to be found. There would also be an airport, a large cosmopolitan hotel and convention center, various spaces for recreation, churches and schools, and an array of varying shops and restaurants. It would be a marvel for tourists just passing through, and it would be daily life for the near 20,000 who would proudly reside there. Every citizen of EPCOT would be employed in some capacity, whether it be through the numerous businesses within the city center, the EPCOT Industrial Park, or even in the Magic Kingdom. Every resident of EPCOT held a significant responsibility in maintaining this living blueprint of the future. On October 27, 1966, Walt in the studio documented his vision for the rest of the world, as he showed the early stages of what would be the most revolutionary architectural undertaking ever. What is shown here in this 25-minute film are mere slivers of scraps from the personal research and ultimate development that Walt had invested into this venture. There was careful research and intentional arrangement put in every factor of EPCOT's working composition. The beauty of EPCOT, like Disneyland, would be its ability to adapt to the needs of society. Walt on screen stood there proudly, showcasing what would be the ultimate pinnacle of his storied career. EPCOT, if truly completed, was knocking on the door of being one of the most forward moments in human history. Yes, there were a wealth of big things on the horizon for Disneyland and the Walt Disney Organization especially. Walt's plate was certainly full, but his appetite for progress could certainly handle the task. His life had been full of this incredible ambition. Along his journey, he had been faced with several hurdles. Some were harder to get over, and Walt ended up bloodied on the ground many times before. But with each stumble he learned, and with each failure he grew. These falls and defeats inspired his rise and successes, and those hurdles, slowly but surely, throughout his career, were becoming easier to jump over. EPCOT was a race to the broadening future, and Walt was determined to split the ribbon at that visionary finish line. And it was as if nothing could slow him down. But there were other players in that race, and in 1966, those players would finally catch up to him.
Well, if I had it to do over again, I think, no, I don't think I would. I don't know. I hope I don't have to do it over again.
The year is 1966, and folks at home are exploring new enterprises as William Shatner as Captain Kirk leads the world on the first ever Star Trek. And pow, wham, bang, The Dark Knight makes his first theatrical appearance in Batman the movie, starring Adam West as the Caped Crusader. And America gets a bit crunchier as Doritos, with their genesis in Frontierland, become the first nationally distributed tortilla chip. And Disneyland is getting ready for more attractions. The World's Fair had ended its run nearly a year before 1965. While being plagued with various issues behind the scenes, the 1964 World's Fair would be recalled on fondly, proving to be one of the most exciting and enjoyable fairs from a public standpoint in recent years. This perception of success can be attributed to several factors, but arguably the largest being the involvement of Walt Disney and his Imagineers. Large corporations were able to sponsor and fund the development of these attractions. The long-term plan for each of them would find them, upon completion of the fair, to be relocated to Disneyland, where they would continue to delight and entertain guests for years to come. 1966 would be the inaugural year for two of these World's Fair attractions within the parks, Ford's Magic Skyways and It's a Small World. At the fair, Ford's Magic Skyway was one of the most attended pavilions. Produced in sponsorship with the Ford Motor Company, Walt and Imagineering developed a unique attraction that would take guests via Ford motor car from the beginning of prehistoric past to the dreamy prospect of a Ford-centric future. In scope, this was arguably the most ambitious of the attractions that Disney agreed to do. Disney needed to develop a pavilion that would promote the Ford brand and models, as well as reveal the brand new addition to the Ford family making its debut at the fair, the Ford Mustang. The show building in itself was a sight to see. It largely covered an area of over 270,000 square feet, and the ride path inside was nearly a half a mile long. For the main attraction, Imagineering decided to use actual Ford convertible cars as the ride vehicles. They were redesigned for the cutting-edge ride system that would connect them to a constantly in motion track. This kept each vehicle going at the correct speed always. It greatly simplified the load and unload process, and it became one of the higher capacity attractions at the fair. Ford's Magic Skyway could accommodate nearly 4,000 visitors every hour. The ride began as guests would board their Ford cars, and Walt himself would tune in on the in-car radio to narrate the attraction. Walt would speak to them as they spiraled up a corridor and into a time tunnel that would take the guests back in history to the age of dinosaurs. The art of audio animatronics had brought the long-extinct giants to life in a way never realized. Passengers encountered mammoth, life-size interpretations of nature's most fearsome predators as Walt casually offered the history and insight about the behemoths that were on display before them.
You're probably familiar with some of their names: Allosaurus, Edaphosaurus, Pterodactyl. Not exactly the kind of pets you would keep around the house. In fact, most of them were kind of supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and that's as big as they come.
Guests would drive by a quartet of towering, long-necked brontosaurs dining on some treetop foliage. They would see a hatching family of triceratops and a looming flock of menacing pteranodons. They would daringly witness a stegosaurus and a tyrannosaurus rex battle it out for prehistoric dominance. These were within visually impressive sets, accented with plants, fog, and bubbling waterfalls that helped set the scene. With a flourish of the cinematic score, the Ford motor car would send guests into the dawn of man and the Stone Age. Here, guests would find light and humorous depictions of early Neanderthals as they hunt woolly mammoths, discover fire, and most importantly, create the wheel. This was the element that tied the attraction together. The ride would conclude as guests would catapult into the space age, the world of the future where Ford reigns supreme. In view of the dazzling spectacle of a future city, guests would slowly careen down as the ride would conclude and empty them into a special Ford showroom, where various Ford models were on display. Accompanying this gallery was a melody written especially by the Sherman Brothers, which would encourage guests to get the feel of the wheel of a Ford.
Get the feel of the wheel of a Ford. Settle back, take command, hold tomorrow in your hand. Get the feel of the wheel of a Ford.
As the fair ended, Disney began more sharply considering the relocation of the attraction, but there were some points of concern. Firstly, there just wasn't enough space to house the huge attraction at Disneyland, and secondly, the Ford company opted not to continue their sponsorship of the attraction outside of the fair, so the cost would be wholly on Disney. This allowed Walt to modify the attraction, bringing back only the elements he liked. Walt loved the dinosaurs in the exhibit, but he felt that the caveman, in comparison to the other audio animatronic offerings of the fair, weren't exactly up to his standards, and so they stayed behind in New York to once again be forgotten by history. On July 1st, 1966, the new edition of the Primeval World was added to the Disneyland Railroad. Upon conclusion of their tour of the Grand Canyon, guests would then once again be trekked to the past where they would witness Disney's dinosaurs on display in a similar setting to that of the Magic Skyway. This would serve as the grand finale to the Grand Circle Tour of the Disneyland Railroad, which would find the final stop of the Main Street station just a few hundred feet away. While not every piece of the attraction was relocated to Disneyland, certainly the revolutionary ride design and engineering concepts would be implemented heavily within several attractions being developed for the park in the years to come. However, this year the road would end for some aspects of Tomorrowland. 1966 would see the closure of numerous attractions therein. For being a vision of the future, Tomorrowland was becoming more and more dated every day, and Walt wanted to revitalize the space with some new energy and excitement. To make way for these changes, rides and attractions like Tomorrowland Jets and the Rocket to the Moon would all close their doors for considerable reimagining, while attractions like the Hall of Chemistry and the Flying Saucers would cease operation permanently before the end of the year. These closures said goodbye to the futuristic forecasts of the recent past and began preparing a new vision, welcoming the evolving concepts of tomorrow and the possible future it could imaginably bring. Certainly there was a Tomorrowland, great, big, and beautiful, shining over the horizon. Despite these closures, though, Disneyland saw a year of tremendous growth within the park. On July 24, 1966, Disneyland's largest expansion project yet was officially unveiled. The brand new land, New Orleans Square. A tribute to the New Orleans of yesteryear when the port served as the festive social center of the American frontier. This seamless addition against Frontierland brought new and exciting vistas along the rivers of America as the landscape took on the scenery of a lovingly recreated 1850s New Orleans. It was a careful recreation, as historically accurate as the story could allow, offering the most immersive Disney experience to date. Within New Orleans Square, guests were surrounded by jubilant ambiance. The sounds of lively brass would echo out of every corner. There was a slew of various and unique offerings, including new signature restaurants like the French Market or the Sara Lee Café Orleans. A mint julep bar offered refreshing refreshment to those watching the boats on the waterway. There was a glass-blowing shop, a hat boutique, a spice store, a perfumery, and an antique emporium filled with one-of-a-kind artifacts. Visual and architectural accents like the flower market, and the balconies that were generally full of life, and the grand court featuring an elegant spiral staircase gave even more energy to the bustling space. Dixieland jazz bands would parade and warble through the New Orleans streets. It was a spirited space full of zest and authenticity. It was as far removed from the rest of Disneyland as it could be, and even without premium ticketed attractions to entice them in, guests could easily spend significant portions of their Disneyland day within the fun atmosphere that Disney had recreated there. Of course, New Orleans Square wasn't finished, and future attractions including Pirates and Ghosts were getting their final touches and would soon be remarkable pluses to the land. But even before that, New Orleans Square was all in all a sensational experience.
It is also here that we dreamed up the things for the World's Fair. And some of those things are coming back to Disneyland. And especially one that I'm in love with is the story of the children of the world. We call it It's a Small World.
There were 11 months left. Pepsi-Cola had secured a significant patch of real estate for the impending World's Fair without a clear direction for what they wanted to achieve. The World's Fair was a prime location for branding and advertisement, and Pepsi wanted to ensure their presence there. A sponsorship with the UNICEF Pavilion was their admirable way of achieving that. UNICEF was the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. The organization had begun in World War II, offering food and relief to mothers and children within heavily impacted areas. This varying assistance would continue well after the end of the war all over the world, and by 1953, it was a permanent component of the United Nations. A large factor of UNICEF's funds came from private donorship. This World's Fair Pavilion would serve as a place to raise awareness and offer support to the children of the world. Plus, Pepsi. Pepsi wanted to feature an attraction that would be honoring to UNICEF, but they couldn't quite land on a definitive theme or concept that they liked. Crunched for time, and with the World's Fair fast approaching, they had begun construction on the show building without any idea of what kind of attraction would be housed within. It wasn't until the last minute when Pepsi-Cola board member and famous actress Joan Crawford suggested that Walt Disney be placed in charge of developing the attraction. After all, she had been hearing numerous things about her colleague in show business's involvement in the fair, how the attractions he was working on were innovative and impressive. She believed that Walt's ingenuity plus the Disney knack for entertaining families and specifically children would be a perfect fit for whatever this UNICEF pavilion could be. Without much choice, Pepsi reluctantly requested the assistance of the Disney company. At first, they received an initial decline from Disneyland head Admiral Joe Fowler, who reasoned they were too pressed for time and energy, what with the 3 other technologically advanced projects they were already working on. However, when Walt found out about this, he was considerably upset. He reminded Fowler that he was the one who made the decisions. "Call them back," he said. "We're going to do this." With an uncomplicated L-shaped building already in construction, they began a planning, design, feasibility study. Imagineering would pore over the potential possibilities and layouts and see what they could come up with. Perhaps it was because something like this was already brewing in Walt's mind, but he had a concept for a little boat ride, as he called it. He came up with the idea, the Children of the World, wherein riders would witness multiple children from around the globe, all singing their native country's national anthem. It would be a celebration of world culture and the innocence of childhood. Several Imagineers like Claude Coates, Mark and Alice Davis, and Rolly Crump would have their hands heavily in this production. But if any Imagineer were to be given ultimate credit for the look and design and feel of this attraction, those accolades would have to go to Imagineer and Disney artist Mary Blair. Mary Blair had been a heavy player within the Disney studios for some time, offering visually unparalleled concept art and contrasting color schemes for films like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. Mary Blair had a distinctive style that was so outside the norm of the Disney studio, and feeling creatively boxed, she felt Disney animation was not a great fit for her. So, in 1953, she amicably split from the studio and began her career illustrating for advertisements and children's books. As Walt was reflecting on how he could incorporate the Disney element into his Children of the World theme, Mary Blair's art and style kept creeping into his mind. Particularly, he kept going back to a segment she produced in his 1940 film called The Three Caballeros. This short portion within the film, called Los Posadas, showcased a group of Mexican children traditionally celebrating Christmas by symbolically recreating the walk of Mary and Joseph from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The animation was subdued, barely any movement on screen at all, but the design of the singing children was singular, and the piece carried a weight to it that Walt adored. Walt was convinced that Mary Blair's style, her fusion of contrasting colors and stylized shapes, was the way to go for the Children of the World attraction. Walt believed if Imagineering could transition that standout style to a 3-dimensional environment, they would have a distinctly artistic and charming attraction. Walt reached out to his former artist with a request to oversee the design of the UNICEF attraction, and she obliged, beginning work on the attraction just 9 months before the fair opened. Mary Blair quickly developed some concepts featuring her distinctive style that would showcase the children from all around the world, and when they brought these concepts to the Pepsi company, they were unimpressed and resistant, considering backing out of the whole thing. But once again, it was actress Joan Crawford who practically scolded her fellow board members and told them they were going to complete Walt's Children of the World attraction. And they did. The attraction was officially announced to the public in August of 1963, where Robert Moses, head of the World's Fair, predicted it would be one of the most popular exhibits of the entire thing. There was still a great deal of work to accomplish in that time, mechanics to figure out and elements to fine-tune. Imagineering was fast at work. Bob Gurr, in tandem with the Aero Development Company, would establish the iconic boat ride system. By utilizing hidden water jets and varying guidance processes, the boats could float along at an exactly desired speed. There would be 72 20-passenger boats that would cruise throughout the 1,500-foot-long, 120,000-gallon-full waterway. This ingenious new system would allow for one of the highest hourly capacities for any attraction at the fair. The ride would feature well over 200 audio animatronic dolls that the Imagineers lovingly coined as rubberheads. These rubberheads were adapted from Mary Blair's style seen in her concept art and children's book illustrations. They were challengingly brought into the third dimension by Imagineer Blaine Gibson and dressed by Imagineer Alice Davis. As far as the clothing for each of the rubberheads, Walt was adamant that no expense be spared. He informed Alice Davis to disregard any budget and that he wanted each to have the most beautiful costumes she could make. The wardrobe that each of the rubberheads would be adorned in would be authentic to the culture it was representing. This was important to Walt. In addition to the rubberheads, Imagineers Rolly Crump and Jack Fergus designed and constructed nearly 250 various animatronic toys and animals to be placed throughout the attraction. This ensured there was not only something, but a lot of things to be seen in any direction you could possibly glance while on board. The influence of Mary Blair was significant in the color and styling of each room of the attraction. Each transition from set to set would be grand and noticeable as the hues would swap with each changing region. The final scene would have the children of the world, the children of all nations, unite together in white, in gold, and in harmony. Despite these intentionally contrasting differences throughout the ride, there was a specific element that was tying the whole attraction together. The original idea was that each scene featured the authentic national anthem of that corresponding country. That just didn't work, as the varying melodies of different tones and voices did not fuse well, making jarring transitions, and it quotably became a cacophony of noise that would not work in an attraction designed to be enjoyable. Walt once again called upon his staff songwriters, the Sherman Brothers, who were fast composing music and lyrics for countless other Disney and Disneyland productions like The Enchanted Tiki Room and the upcoming Carousel of Progress, to write up a piece that could work for the Children of the World attraction. Walt wanted it to be a round, something that could easily and endlessly be played on a loop. As he was explaining the message of purity and togetherness he wanted the attraction to convey, and the spirit of friendship he wanted to hear in the song, he casually dropped the phrase, "It's a small world after all," never intending it to be used beyond a simple description. But the remark struck a chord with the Sherman Brothers, who rapidly came up with a simple ballad based around that concept. They played it for Walt, who loved it, so much so that it inspired him to change the name of the attraction to It's a Small World. The song is able to achieve the thematic desire of the original intention and transitions to different languages throughout the attraction seamlessly. During the ride, guests would hear It's a Small World in English, Spanish, Italian, Japanese, and Swedish. The instrumentation for each of the sections changes fluidly as well, highlighting specific instruments crucial to the regions of the designated countries. It's been estimated that on a typical day, It's a Small World would play through nearly 1,200 times. Pepsi Cola presents Walt Disney's It's a Small World, A Salute to UNICEF, opened on April 22, 1964. Over the course of the fair, more than 10 million people would enter into the attraction, boasting one of the highest attendances of the event. There was a cost to enter, a special admission, with the earnings supposedly going to support UNICEF. The price was $1 for adults, 60 cents for kids. In addition to the attraction, guests would be prone to encounter Disney characters and other elements surrounding the pavilion. From a visual standpoint, the main feature of the area would be the Tower of the Four Winds, a 12-story kinetic sculpture that could be seen from all over the fairgrounds. It would serve as a visual magnet to bring the guests in closer to the attraction, but it became iconic in its own right as a simple meeting place for the entire fair.
To meet you under the Tower of the Four Winds at our pavilion.
The tower was designed by Rolly Crump, and it featured 52 moving pieces. Underneath was a gift shop, with its most popular sold item being an LP recording of the ride, narrated by Winston Hibbler. It was also here under the tower where guests could make additional contributions towards UNICEF, the focus of the entire pavilion. As always intended, upon the end of the fair, the attraction would be disassembled and relocated to Anaheim. The Disneyland show building would be a third larger than its Flushing Meadows counterpart, and this not only gave Imagineers more room to work with, but also more room to fill. So a few more scenes were added, including an area depicting the North Pole and the Pacific Islands. This lengthened the cruise from 9 minutes to 12 minutes. Notably absent from the Disneyland installment was the Tower of the Four Winds. The cost to relocate it to Disneyland was just too much to justify, and some rumors suggest that at the end of the fair it was cut up and dumped into the nearby East River. But It's a Small World in Disneyland would not be without its distinctive architecture. The queue would begin outside as guests would load into the boats amidst a variety of topiary. The facade, also designed by Crump, would be adorned with whimsical turrets and a plethora of varying representations of different world landmarks like the Taj Mahal or the Eiffel Tower. The centerpiece of the facade would be a large, smiley-faced clock 30 feet up that would happily rotate back and forth every single second. Every 15 minutes, the clock would chime and guests in line would be met with a pre-show of sorts, as each quarter would invite a parade of dancing toys out of the small doors beneath. This would prompt the actual time via wooden blocks to be displayed. Crump had designed the exterior based on another Mary Blair concept design. Naturally, it was colorful like the rest of her artwork, but from a maintenance standpoint in Disneyland, it would be a nightmare. The California sun would bake all of the colors of the paint. Crump adapted her vision into white and gold, which would be more reasonable from an upkeep perspective, but would also more closely match the grand finale of the attraction held within. It's a Small World opened in Disneyland on May 28, 1966. On hand for the dedication and festivities were 36 officials from varying countries from all over the world, as well as the International Children's Choir of Long Beach. As they dedicated the attraction, children from 16 different nations poured water from the 7 seas and the 9 major lagoons into the waterway. Walt himself joined in and poured in waters taken from the close-by rivers of America. The dedication was fully genuine and not just for show. The water had been shipped into California from all over the world at a significant cost. The opening event was coined as Operation Water. Doves and balloons were released above to signify peace and joy between the nations, the ultimate dream of the attraction. It's a Small World would be entertaining guests old and young for ages to come. It's a Small World is simple in almost every way, simple shapes, simple colors, and simple floating. But its message for longing and achievable brotherhood is profound. It was a sentimental cruise with a call to action, to love one another, to live life with a childlike tenderness, and an earworm melody to bring it all home. It's a Small World instantly sailed into the hearts and minds of a generation. Walt's Little Boat Ride. One night, Walt was casually touring the studio, as he often did, and began chatting with Mark Davis in his workspace. Mark gladly updated Walt on the developing Pirates attraction, going over models and discussing concepts that he was a part of. While Mark had Walt, he began showing him some humorous concept work he had drawn for another attraction. He presented Walt with a picture of a band of country music singing bears. It was planned for an entertaining animatronic show to be featured as an accent in one of the restaurants being designed for Mineral King. Walt was amused. He loved it and, unrushed, chuckled with Mark as he showed him more gags that he had created. He stayed as long as Mark could keep him. Mark Davis, while loving the one-on-one time with the boss, could tell something was unusual with Walt. The savoring way he was carrying himself and the conversation, something was off. At the end of their long exchange, Walt stood in the doorway, preparing to leave. Walt looked back towards his creative Imagineer. "Goodbye, Mark," he said. Which immediately struck Mark as strange, because historically, Walt was always one to say, "See you later." This would be the last time Mark and Walt spoke together. No one really knew the severity of Walt's condition, especially Walt himself. As far as the studio was aware, Walt would be gone just a few days. The explanation's simple, just minor neck surgery for an old polo injury that had been bothering him for years. But the truth would lead back far beyond then. Walt began smoking cigarettes unfiltered as a young driver for the Red Cross during World War I. Chesterfields were Walt's brand of choice, and he would smoke 3 packs a day, every day, for the rest of his life. Walt had developed lung cancer, and with it a tumor the size of a walnut. His visit to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center in November of 1966 had not been for any lasting polo injury, but for the partial removal of one of his lungs. The operation was deemed mostly successful, and after 2 weeks, Walt was sent home to recuperate and enjoy the Thanksgiving holiday with his family. It seemed like things were going to be okay, but once Thanksgiving had passed, Walt's condition worsened, and he found himself on December 5th, celebrating his 65th birthday back in the hospital. Walt, over the next several days, would be going in and out of consciousness. The cancer was taking its toll. He had rapidly lost weight, his face had become pale and gaunt, and he frequently groaned that his feet were cold. Walt only allowed his close family in the room with him. He didn't want anybody to remember him this way. No one at the studio was aware of any of this. Walt's big brother Roy was always there. He stood at the edge of the hospital bed, gently rubbing Walt's feet, making sure his kid brother would stay as comfortable as he could. St. Joseph Medical Center was just across the street from the Disney studios. Roy had ordered that the studio keep the lights on overnight so that Walt could easily see the buildings from his bed. In his final conversation with his brother, Walt was steady with excitement as he vividly envisioned the layout of the entire Florida project against the tiles of the ceiling above his bed. Walt had so much left to do. At 9:30 a.m. on December 15th, the cancer took its final blow as his heart quietly stopped and Walt Disney passed on into the ages. He was 65 years old. A nation was in mourning, and a world collectively wept over the loss of history's most fantastic and creative genius. A small service was held the next day for his immediate family at the Little Church of the Flowers at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, California. He was cremated a day later and interred permanently in the Freedom Mausoleum. According to his wishes, these ceremonies were extremely private and were announced to the public after they had taken place. In 1956, Diane Disney wrote of her father, "He never goes to a funeral if he can help it. If he had to go to one, it plunges him into a reverie which lasts for hours after he's home. At such times, he says, 'When I'm dead, I don't want a funeral. I want people to remember me alive.'" What a sentiment. And also, what a reality. Walt left behind his wife, Lily, and his two daughters, Diane and Sharon, his grandchildren and siblings and in-laws, as well as a flourishing company and ideology that had colored the world with a capacity to dream. One would be hard-pressed to find themselves unaffected by Walt and his influences. Walt would live on through a lasting legacy and the powerful impact he had had on the culture, through a catalog of drawings, shorts, television programs, and movies, and most grandly, a whole park that could and would spiritually retell his story. Disneyland, when condensed down to its core main themes, is arguably the best living and breathing reflection of the man Walt Disney. Your first introduction to Disneyland was mirrored after Walt's first introductions to America, a reflection of Walt's boyhood and his American town, filled with pleasant memories of a bygone past. But this Main Street is at a crossroads, a Main Street in motion, a Main Street on the move. Different eras collide on this thoroughfare, modes of transportation are advancing, new technologies are emerging as we walk down the middle. This was progress, and Walt couldn't just sit still. And while Walt loved his hometown, America, he had to get out and explore. He had to get out and change the world. This was the blank yet increasingly detailed canvas where Walt would begin his storied adventure. Main Street was a representation of Walt's longing and blossoming patriotism and his love for country and nostalgia. Main Street, USA, is Walt. It was Walt's spirit of adventure, his thirst to shift the ordinary, a feeling that put him on a train from Kansas City to Los Angeles, where he would continue to take massive leaps into the unfamiliar in an effort to entertain the world. This hunger would send Walt around the globe, finding goodwill and amity in other cultures, peoples, and places. Walt was an ambassador of experience. Adventureland was a representation of Walt's courage and his willingness to explore the unknown to achieve his dreams, no matter the consequences. Adventureland is Walt. Frontier, by definition, means the discovery of the farthest most limits of knowledge and achievement. It may not have been within the limits of tract and territory like the era that Frontierland itself pays homage to, but surely Walt was a frontiersman in his own right in the areas of American entertainment and technology. Walt saw a monochrome tree and said, "Hey, let's give it color." He saw a fairy tale and said, "Let's make it longer." He saw his girls on a merry-go-round and said, "Let's make a place." Walt saw a mechanical bird in a cage and said, "Let's give them a show." Frontierland was a representation of Walt's adoration for discovery and his ceaseless desire to push the boundaries of innovation in whatever path that was before him. Frontierland is Walt. Where would any of this be without Walt's dreams, that creativity that brought a mouse to life, a princess to song, and a castle to California? The beauty of Fantasyland is that the fantastical things there are no longer make-believe. They have been pulled from our daydreams and are actively before us in a physical form. Imagination is the sixth sense as fantasy becomes real, and Walt's story of inspiration safeguards the wish that our wildest ambitions are never out of reach. Fantasyland was a representation of Walt's imagination and his special brand of creativity that made make-believe genuine. Fantasyland is Walt. Walt pined for the nostalgia of the life lived before him. He carried his heart safely in a wistful appreciation for the days of past, but he had his mind fully in the world of the future. Walt lived for today, fondly remembered yesterday, and dreamed of an incredible future formed by the collective of humanity and the potential of all its collaborative achievements. A progress city where technology and design made living together in unity the easiest, if not the only, option. Tomorrowland was a representation of Walt's hopeful optimism and his love for emerging technology and his visions of a hopeful and united world. Tomorrowland is Walt. Walt was regularly quoted as saying it was all started by a mouse. All of it. The films, the park, the memories, all trace back to one Mickey Mouse. It was started by a mouse, he'd say. This is an opinion that can be greatly challenged. The matter was, it was all started by a man with a dream, a man with countless dreams, a man with a drive to pull them from figments and make them so. Walt Disney was the ultimate dreamer, from his hard beginnings in Middle America to his ending days as the amicable uncle of the world. He lived with one goal. He sought to bring joy to everyone by doing the things he loved. He was an example of passion. It was never easy for him. Along with his successes, he had equal failures, but they never kept him down. There was never any before, and there would never be again another like Walt Disney. In the subsequent months, there was a massive change amidst the company. Without its creator to champion it, Walt's unique vision of the community of the future was tabled. Some aspects of the ski resort Mineral King fell through, and it was canceled. Disney animation would stagnate for a bit as they attempted to find their new legs and create new stories without their imaginative shepherd. But Disneyland, what was Disneyland going to do? Disneyland had to keep going. On December 16th, 1966, the day after Walt's time with us was up, Disneyland opened at 9 a.m., just as it had the day before, and just as it would every day after for the foreseeable future. And Walt would be there. And that, my Explorer friends, was 1966, the end of a special chapter in Disneyland for sure, but Walt still had a few more gifts for the world to unwrap, and that'll all happen in the next year of 1967. If you liked this episode, let us know. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. How has Walt impacted you? Until next time, we'll see you in the happy place. Bye!